Welcome to the Momnificent Podcast. This is the place where we help parents live a happy, healthy life with their kids. We're going to show you how to connect with your child and help them even in their most difficult moments as we hear from experts in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Karin Jakubowski, an international speaker, public school principal, and former struggling student. The Momnificent Podcast equips parents with science-based strategies to help you live a happy, healthy life with your kids. Welcome. Has your life grown stale? Do you miss the fun of your younger years? Well, check this out. I have a fun expert as a guest on our show today. Michael Rucker is also author of The Fun Habit and talks about how the disciplined pursuit of joy and wonder can change your life. Michael is an organizational psychologist, behavioral scientist, and charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. And in his 20s, he even swept floors on the television show Baywatch. Here's another crazy fact about him that I love. He crashed the stage with Liz Taylor at a Cannes festival. So funny. He has this picture on his website of the newspaper clipping where he's literally standing right behind Liz Taylor. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. Michael, welcome to Momnificent.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and where are you enjoying Momnificent from today?
I am in North Carolina, the Greensboro area.
Yeah, a little south of me, so you still have a little bit of warm weather, right?
Yeah, it's actually been nice lately because we've been getting, like a lot of folks in the South, been getting a lot of rain. I grew up in California, and my parents are still in the Sacramento area, so they've been, so dry there. It's sort of this weird dichotomy where this has been one of the wettest summers for us here in the South, and they really need the water out there. So it's
Right? Yeah. Crazy how that happens. So, Michael, what's one thing you've done recently that maybe you haven't done for a while that just brings you joy?
yeah. So obviously, because I've been at this a while, I feel like I have a pretty well-tuned life with regards to fun. So, but one thing that I have been doing lately has been trying to reconnect with friends. So I've been having a few minor health issues and just being reminded, I just recently turned 50, so I'm trying to do all the right things, and one of those is habitually going on a 30-minute walk every day. But I have this strategy that I talk about in the book called activity bundling, and I hadn't really been doing that. And so now when I go on my walks, generally I was listening to music or Audible, and now I'm really trying to make a concerted effort to connect with old friends, mainly because so many of us lost contact during the pandemic. I think we all sort of levitated towards social media, and that was a way to stay connected, but it wasn't real one-on-one connection and sort of sharing those intimate moments that you necessarily wouldn't share with the public, but are very meaningful between one-on-one interactions. So that's something that I've really been mindful about, instead of listening to a podcast or an audiobook, really biasing more towards connecting with friends. Even if I'm having to schedule it, like, hey, Luke, I'm going to go on a walk at 1:30. Would you have that time? And if he's like, no, I'll schedule my walk at 3. So really trying to accommodate, folks that have busy lives. And generally, when you kind of put, your good foot forward, they'll reciprocate, like, wow, okay, you're going to make time for me. And that's been a nice upward spiral to really reconnect with folks that are really meaningful to me.
That's so awesome. And the difference in probably how you feel differently after having that connection, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it always pays, not that you're looking for dividends or relationships should be transactional, but again, I think, it starts this sort of wave of reciprocation. And so these connections get strengthened again, so many that kind of gotten loose because we were all sort of falling down Maslow's triangle, right? And then we were all kind of scared and nervous. And so a lot of times that makes people turn inward. And I think now that we all feel a bit safer, it's time to sort of climb our way out of these holes and reconnect with one another. And that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so important. So you are a father of kids that are getting closer to their teens now, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And
Okay.
my daughter certainly acts like one.
Right, way older than they probably should. And how did your book, The Fun Habit, come about?
Um, I've always been a big zealot of positive psychology. You had mentioned that in the bio. I got access to it early on. An early mentor of mine is a gentleman by the name of Michael Gervais, who's kind of made a name for himself. He has a nice podcast himself called Finding Mastery, and he was the sports psychologist for the Seattle Seahawks. But I was fortunate enough to get him while I believe he was still getting his clinical hours as a psychologist. And so he introduced me to Marty Seligman and Charles Garfield and Csikszentmihalyi before they even had kind of coalesced into a Congress. And so I started following these folks and really got passionate about positive psych. And positive psych served me well up until about 2016. And I guess what's important in that too is that at the time I was living in San Francisco and was also part of the kind of quantified self community. So not only was I practicing all this positive psych tools and strategies and tactics, but I was also like kind of being a nerd about it and like tracking my happiness, looking for correlations, looking if I did certain things, like would they increase my happiness? And I got kind of weird about it. But then in 2016, I had a couple unfortunate events. One was my younger brother passed away suddenly from a pulmonary embolism, so sort of out of the blue. And then unrelated, a couple of months later, I found out I had advanced osteoarthritis, and this was after almost over a decade of amateur endurance sport. So I'd done a couple Ironman, a couple half Ironman, and really enjoyed running. It was the primary mechanism for mitigating anxiety. Really the way I kept myself mentally healthy, I think probably was better for me for my mental health and my physical health. And because of that, I was told I could never run again. I had to get an early hip replacement. And when you get a hip replacement before your 50s, they're essentially car parts, right? And so if you're going to live a long time and you get one young, they ask you not to do high impact sport, which running is one of those, or you likely would have to get it remediated later in life, which has a lot worse outcome, right? Because now they're cutting in scar tissue and stuff. So I had to accept the fact that I wasn't going to run again. And I was also mourning my brother's death. But here I am, this zealot of positive psychology. And I'm like, well, I can will myself to be happy, right? And I realized, now with the power of hindsight, I realized that the more that I was doing that, I was actually making myself more unhappy. And I think luckily I was aware enough to kind of realize this was happening. The more that I was trying to like be grateful for things in a time that I really should have been mourning and really overly concerned with this concept of happiness and why can I just accept things as they were. I started to unpack that. And I think through serendipity, there was emerging science that, especially here in the Western world, that folks that are overly concerned with happiness, so not necessarily valuing happiness, which I still overtly do, and I think is a good thing. I think we should support human flourishing and wanting people to be happy. But people that are overly concerned about their own happiness actually are some of the most unhappy people. It often leads to mental illness, or at least has a high correlation. So we don't know if people that are predisposed to mental illness tend to be concerned about their own happiness or vice versa. But we do know for sure that it is an ill-fated habit. And I had kind of fallen victim to that. And so I quickly realized that if some of these positive psychology interventions that weren't appropriate in that moment couldn't help me, then what could I do? And so I started digging into this research of, how can we use fun and play to sort of mitigate negative experiences? And most of that work came from education. And so I found this huge research gap, which is it's like finding gold, right? Like for a researcher and academic, I found this big research gap in utilizing action-oriented approaches for inviting more joy and delight into your life. And so it was something that I latched on, and I kind of been researching it ever since, because I used it in my own life to sort of get through that period of malaise. And So why I think it's important, right, is that we now know, especially in the last 10 years, that through science like broaden and build theory, Barbara Fredrickson's work and others, that we don't necessarily want to over optimize what science calls positive emotions, right? Like we need a wide breadth of emotion to be able to build resilience, because if we never experience the downsides or sort of accept them and understand how to live in those moments, then we'll get walloped when they do happen. And that's sort of what happened to me. But that a lot of us also undervalue the agency and autonomy we have, that even if we are living in a time, a time of loss, whether that's divorce or leaving an area that you're familiar with, or the loss of a loved one, where the appropriate affect and emotion tends to be on the negative side of valence, which is just a geeky way of saying, that happiness isn't an appropriate response for those particular life events, that you can still organize your life in a way where you can still smile and still connect with folks, that bring in feelings of, happiness and pleasure, and still have this appropriate time in your life where you're also, getting over a traumatic experience.
Mm. Oh wow, you said so much there. And I want to back up to the one of the first things you said, because maybe we have a listener today and they aren't as familiar with the term positive psychology. How would you define that in like layman's terms?
Yeah, so positive psych came about because clinical psychology had really always been about treating people, right? And so, some of the folks, the early folks like Diener and Csikszentmihalyi, and some folks might not know who Csikszentmihalyi is, but he is the grandfather of flow. So if you've ever heard of flow state, he's the one that did all the geeky science behind it to kind of prove it as an authentic construct. And so these folks had early on, I don't know how deep you want to go in the history, but to make a long story short, it was really Marty Seligman that had brought it forth and kind of coalesced the science as a discipline. And it was a group of psychologists that wanted to look at how could you use psychological tools to take someone who might not necessarily be seeking out clinical treatment for a deficit, but using aspects of psychology to actually make their lives better. And so, in short, clinical psychology is usually to treat a deficit like depression or anxiety or some sort of mental disorder, and positive psychology are tools to make someone who might be at a baseline. I try not to use the word normal anymore, because what does normal mean, right? But at the baseline of something that we would think is normalized, and get themselves to a better place.
Mm.
But even in that, in and of itself, for any psychologists listening, is problematic, because all of these things are then on a scale, right? And so that's something that I unpack in the book, is that ultimately we're never meant to optimize to a certain thing. Like there's always something better out there. That's why happiness, sometimes we refer to it as the hedonic treadmill, right? Because we really are, part of evolution. Purpose for pleasure is because we need to do certain things to live, but then that's meant to dissipate so that we go out and do it again, right? Things like eating high calorie dense food, or something as pleasurable as procreating, right? Like these things are meant to be fleeting so that we continue to do them, because if that was an ever present act of pleasure, then we wouldn't strive, right? And so, anyways, again, probably too long-winded of an answer, but positive psych's purpose is to create psychological tools that help us to do things better rather than treat deficits.
Yeah, that's so good. And who would you say your book is written for?
Yeah, I think it's anyone that's sort of, the three areas that I look at are burnout, boredom, or loneliness, right? And so I think the majority is going to be burnt out, right? Especially for that sandwich generation where our lives are just overprescribed and we feel that everything comes from the sense of duty. Like you're not finding joy in raising your kids. Your interactions with your parents just feel like, you're trying to get to the next day. And, at work, especially if you're in knowledge work, you don't really know what the finish line is, right? So the first act is kind of creating that space so that you can start integrating things that are meaningful to you back in your life. And then sort of some advanced strategies of figuring out, okay, how do I reframe these moments, with my kids? Because I can co-create these experiences with them. It's not that I have to sit there at the park on my phone and kind of just wait out the 2 hours because,
Right.
that's my job. Like I can actually take them and do something that I like, as long as it's something that they agree to too, because that's what they would do with their friends. Like if their friends were doing something they didn't like, that wouldn't be their friends anymore. So like, why can't parents use that same logic, right? So
Yeah.
it's just a host of different, sort of eye-opening ideals, that come out in the book. Like, hey, you know, you don't even necessarily need to change your circumstance. There are just certain things that you can do time and time again that are going to start to reintegrate joy and delight into your life.
I love that you shared that because it made me think of a conversation I literally had just this week with a grandmother who lives with her daughter and her daughter's kids in their house. And she made this comment to me, and it made me think of it in our interview today. She said, Karin, my grandkids don't even laugh much anymore. They're so serious. And that just makes me sad because you talk about the rarely examined benefits of fun, and how can we help our kids, or how could I even help this grandmother who might even listen to this podcast as I shared with her? How can we help our kids lighten up? How can we help them laugh and not be so serious?
Yeah, so when I hear you, ask this question, I saw this meme recently that I think applies here, and I just really love it. So it's this mom and child, and she's talking to another parent and child. They're both on a bench, and the child's reading, and she's like, "How did you get your daughter to read?" And the mom is looking bewildered, and she has a book in her hand too, and the mom asking that mom has a phone in her hand and the child has a tablet and is playing on the tablet, right? And so, the punchline or the moral of that cartoon is that children are sponges. I mean, one of the tenets of anyone that's taken a psychology 101 class, even in high school, is that we all model behavior of folks that we admire, and children admire their parents. And so, not necessarily saying this grandma's doing anything wrong, but I think if you're seeing a lack of behavior from your child that you would like to elicit, the best strategy for doing that is figuring out how can we co-create an environment and circumstances that are going to get us all laughing. So maybe that's,
Okay.
a comedy show that's appropriate for a child, or maybe that's playing a game that is going to be, super silly, like Pie in the Face is a game that we enjoy here at the house, or another one that we just love. It's impossible not to laugh. It's so silly, is that one where instead of playing charades, you have to speak out what the thing is with that dental apparatus in your mouth. Have you ever played that? And you just can't get
Oh,
words out. It's bananas, and it's just so impossible not to laugh. So I mean, because I do these, not to villainize social media, because I always try to sort of roll that back. These things are tools, but they are built to capitalize on attention because they are capitalist machines, right? Their products are attention because they make their money on gaining your attention. And so, especially if a child is overprescribed to that, then you need to figure out ways to mitigate it. And the primary, not to use a geeky word again, but the primary intervention to do so is model the behavior that you would like to see in them. I mean, it's an easy thing to do. And, it has added benefits because you're going to end up laughing as well, and a lot of times you see behavior in other people that you actually, want to see in yourself. So not that this grandma, it falls into that category, but, mirroring and modeling are very, basic psychological concepts, right? We often tend to see things in others that we'd like to see in ourselves as well, both negative and positive. So
Yeah.
I
As soon
hope
as
this
you,
grandmother hears this and takes her kids to a comedy show or buys one of these silly games at Target and starts
yes.
creating laughter with her grandkids.
Absolutely. And the word model, when you said that, or the mirrors, because I always say our kids are mirrors of us. So like whatever we are doing, they're going to be end up doing the same exact thing, whether the behavior or, like you said, the reading, or it, if the phone is the important thing, that's what they're going to learn. That's the important thing, over reading. Can you describe one of your parenting failures and what you learned from it?
Oh my goodness. So it's a favorite. I'm sure if people have heard me before, they've heard this one, but it's a favorite of mine. So I wanted to be the dad of the year. And I don't believe my son was born yet, or if he was still just months old. But my daughter was 4, I believe. And she really loved the movie Tangled. And for a long time, I wanted to go to a lantern festival because I had heard it was this really spiritual event and, just really majestic. And so I told my wife, I'm like, we're going to go on a father-daughter trip. I'm going to take her out to the desert in Nevada. There's this amazing festival called Rise where they do these lanterns, and my wife was all for it. And so we, drove all night to Nevada from, I think we were staying at my in-laws in LA. Ended up in Vegas, so that's a whole another story we could say for another time. Um, and we went to the Rise Festival, and one of the mistakes that I made is that I went with a preconceived notion of how I wanted the night to go. I wanted Sloan to understand that this was really meaningful. It was exactly as it was advertised. They had all this kind of trance music, and people were writing like really meaningful things on their lanterns. We had talked to a few people, that were mourning loss, so they were writing, messages of grief, that were meant to go out in the air and kind of release from their bodies. So there was some deep meaning there. There was also a lot of joy because it was, kind of a really cool event, and certainly a lot of joy around Sloan because she was being, she was essentially a toddler and doing what toddlers were doing, right? She was introducing herself to everyone, and but meanwhile, she's also trampling all over their blankets. These are lanterns that have, a flammable component, and she's kind of getting near, fire. And so I'm trying to reel her in. No one else seems to be bothered by her, but I certainly am, right? And slowly but surely, I let the fact that she had her own preconceived notions of how she wanted to go affect mine, because I had never really asked her, what she wanted to get out of it. And so by the end, we let off the lantern and it was fun. And obviously, her being young, they only let you do one, because it's really meant to be this one kind of big release. And immediately after it was done, she was asking for another one. And at that point, I just lost my mind and I was like kind of done with it. And I thought like the whole, night had been ruined. And so we got into a food line, because we had to get food. At this point, it was late and we hadn't even eaten dinner. And the food line was like obnoxiously long. I think we waited like for 40 minutes. And 1 minute before getting, to the window to order our food, she's like, "Daddy, I gotta go pee." And I was like,
No.
"Yeah." I'm like, "We can't. We're about to get our food." And she's like, "Daddy, I really gotta go." And I said those immortal, 2 words, no, 3 words. Yeah, just hold it. And of course, like right when we got to the window, she peed her pants. And I was
Oh,
like, and it all just washed over me how incredibly ignorant I had been, right? Like I hadn't set us up for success because I went in there because it was supposed to be my night and her accompanying it. But she's a little kid, that wasn't her problem at all. I'm the one with wisdom, right? And it could have been a total magic night if I had built in that and kind of asked her what she wanted to do and realized that I was also, in essence, co-creating a space that would be appropriate for a 4-year-old, where there's certainly opportunities there. I didn't get us in a situation where that wouldn't have been. I just wanted to all go my way. And because it didn't, I ruined the night for both of us. And so, uh, in that moment, we both got really adult, and I kind of confessed that I had really screwed things up. And, because she's amazing, she immediately accepted my apology. And so I hoisted her up, urine and all on my shoulders, and walked back to the parking lot. And we enjoyed our food while kind of laughing all the way back to our car. So I redeemed myself in the end, but it's certainly one of my biggest parenting fails.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that with us because even like what you said earlier, like life it is wonderful at times. It is the most difficult thing at times, and it's in sometimes in those most difficult moments that it really builds that character in you. And I think sometimes we paint a picture of what life should or could be, or maybe as parents we're like, well, I don't want my kid to have the life I had growing up, and so some of that I don't even think is a benefit to our kid because it's really in the times of lack when you don't have things or you have to work hard or things aren't like the bed of roses that is what builds who you are today, that makes up everything that you bring to the table of a well-rounded person. And so what's one of the best pieces of advice you received that you want to leave our listeners with today? Maybe it's something you live by.
Yeah. Well, it's funny in the context of this story. I just had an amazing interview with a professor out of the University of Colorado. Her name's Samira, and she passed this on to me from another person. So I guess that's what wisdom does, is wisdom does, right? And it was that there's no extra credit in the struggle. And even though I guess at first blush that sounds a little bit negative, I really took it as this amazing positive, right? Because it kind of feeds into what you just said. And that is that so many of us, when things go wrong, kind of want that extra credit. Like, oh my gosh, well, I set all this up, right? And I've kind of learned from that mistake. Like to your point, I think very much so. My parents were both professors. And, when tenure was still important. So I didn't see them a lot. And I am trying, in my own way to make up for what I thought was lacking when I was a child. But when things don't go my way, I don't beat myself up anymore because there is no extra credit in the struggle. Like if you, find yourself in these situations, you need to find what they mean to you, and you are able to create that. And so having emotional flexibility becomes really important because once you understand that breadth, then it allows you to snap back that much quicker. But I think if you get kind of wallowed down, like, why are all of these things happening to me? And sort of hold that weight and aren't able to let it go, then finding joy and delight become that much more problematic. And so the way I often refer to it is agency and autonomy. We generally, we're a product of our choices, and oftentimes the results of those choices are things completely out of our control. That's just life, right? So I think that's where a lot of self-help fails, because yes, we are the product of our choices, but a lot of times we can make the right choices time and time again, and then just circumstance punches us in the face, right? But we
Yeah.
often have a lot more agency and autonomy of how we deal with those circumstances than we believe. And again, it, if you look at parenting as dutiful, where you're always kind of on the clock, versus co-creating playful moments with your kids, where you take back a little bit of that control and tell your child, well, hey, I don't really like this, like watching you play Hot Wheels for 2 hours. But what I would like to do is go on a hike. Would that be appropriate? And maybe they'll compromise, like, okay, well, I don't want to walk for 2 hours, but if we end up in the playground for the second half, that would be great, right? It's really just taking that extra step and realizing that, things don't go your way, kind of having that growth mindset, right? Like, okay, well, this didn't work, shoot, but we can make it work better and learn from this previous experience. So, yeah, I think that's the one that I'm playing with right now, and I think it's extremely powerful.
And I love how you say, parents, to have fun with your kid doesn't mean you have to play Candyland with them for 2 hours. I love that example that you give. And that's exactly what you were just saying. Like, if you can compromise and if you can just be real with what you enjoy, what they enjoy, and find that medium, you're going to find something together that you actually are going to get something out of it. It's going to be fun and rewarding.
Yeah, and
Well,
I know I've geeked out a lot on the science already, so I hope I didn't bore your audience. But
it's all
um,
good.
to move really quick through some of the science behind that, it's referred to as transactional analysis. And all I would say is it doesn't matter that you know the science, but that as a general rule, we believe that as adults, we operate in three different spaces, right? A childlike space, a parent-like space, and an adult-like space. And just too often, and this comes from original research I did, but has been replicated, too often we just get stuck in that parental role and we don't allow ourselves to get back in a playful state. So like even when we're in something like a science museum or a children's museum where it's appropriate to co-play with your kid and sort of, live in this world of awe and wonder, instead we turn it into homework and we're like, oh no, you really should build the house this way because all houses need a window. Like, why not let your kid lead a little bit, or why not just enjoy it and co-create and realize they're not doing anything wrong. They're just being a 5-year-old in this space. And then when you want them to be architects, you can start deciding where the windows go.
Yes, yes. Oh, this is so good. Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. And thank you for all the effort and research that you did putting into this book that can really be such a help for so many of us, parents, even educators, grandparents, even, and those who work with kids. And how can someone find and follow you?
Yeah, so my website's michaelrucker.com. I'm on Instagram under The Wonder of Fun. And those are the two main places.
The wonder of fun. I love that. Well, thank you again for your time this evening, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey there, it's Karin. I hope that you're enjoying the show. And by the way, if you're a mom who wants to learn how to help your child when they're struggling behaviorally or facing challenges in school, get started today by getting my free short video course, 3 Steps to Happy Healthy Kids, at www.educationalimpactacademy.com/free video. If you're new here or you haven't done this yet, this is definitely the first step to get started in learning how to have a happy, healthy life with your kids. So head on over to www.educationalimpactacademy.com/free video and grab your free gift today. Well, that's all we've got for this episode of the Momnificent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be honored if you would subscribe and rate if you really liked it. I know wherever you're listening right now, it might not be the best time to leave a comment, but feel free to leave a question, a review, or a comment at any time. And until next time, remember, don't worry, be happy.